I never expected that saying yes to a mountain trip would change anything in my life, but maybe that's how these things happen, quietly, without warning, in the small decisions we barely think about. My brother had been planning this weekend hike for months, and when he suddenly cancelled because of work, his friend insisted we still go. I almost refused. Going alone with him felt strange, unnecessary, maybe even inappropriate. But for reasons I couldn't fully explain, I agreed. Maybe I just needed to escape the heaviness I'd been feeling at home. My relationship had been drifting for months. We lived together, but it felt more like sharing a space than sharing a life. Conversations were short and practical. Touches were brief or accidental. Sometimes I'd sit beside him and feel like I was miles away. And yet, I kept pretending things were normal. So when my brother's friend messaged me, saying he'd already packed and was waiting outside, something inside me pushed me to go. I didn't even say goodbye properly before stepping out the door. The drive began with long stretches of silence. He wasn't the talkative type, he never had been. Over the years, he'd always been around, at family gatherings, at dinners, somewhere in the background with quiet smiles and soft laughs. I never thought much about him. But sitting beside him now, with mountains slowly rising in the distance, I realized I didn't really know him at all. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was steady, calm, almost peaceful. The kind of silence that didn't demand anything from me. At one point, he glanced over and asked if I was okay. Not the usual, casual, "You good?" people throw around. His voice carried genuine concern, warmth I wasn't used to hearing. I said I was fine, but he didn't look convinced. "You seem tired," he said, quietly. I didn't respond. I didn't know how to explain the tiredness that wasn't physical, the kind that comes from feeling unseen for too long. As we climbed higher, the air grew colder. Pine trees thinned out, replaced by stretches of open rock and sky so clear it looked unreal. He rolled down his window and let the cold breeze fill the car. I closed my eyes for a moment, savoring the fresh air, the freedom of being somewhere far from the routines that trapped me. When we reached the trail, he handed me a backpack and smiled a little. "I packed extra just in case you forgot anything." It was thoughtful, more thoughtful than anything my partner had done for me in months. It was a small gesture, but it hit deeper than I expected. We started hiking, our steps crunching over gravel and dried leaves. The trail was narrow and surrounded by endless green. Every now and then, he would slow down to match my pace, making sure I wasn't falling behind. When I tripped slightly on a loose rock, he caught my arm, not dramatically, not intensely, just steady and instinctive. His hand lingered for a second longer than necessary, but not long enough to mean anything obvious. Still, my heartbeat changed. We walked for hours, talking lightly about everything except the things that truly mattered. But something was shifting. The way he looked at me when I laughed. The way I found myself noticing his voice, his calmness, the way he made the world feel slower and safer. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was something quieter, something I didn't have a name for. By the time we reached the lodge where we'd spend the night, the sky had turned a soft orange. The view stretched endlessly, clouds touching mountain peaks like they were brushing fingertips. He stood beside me, hands in his pockets, simply taking it in. No comments, no attempts to impress. Just quiet presence. And strangely, that was enough to make my chest feel warm. Later, we sat by the fireplace eating simple food and sharing stories. He listened, really listened, in a way I wasn't used to. When I talked, his eyes stayed focused, patient, as if every word mattered. At one point, he told me he was glad I still came even though my brother didn't. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. As the night deepened and the fire softened, I found myself wondering why being here, with him, felt lighter than being home. And when I caught him quietly watching me while I looked out the window, something inside me shifted, gently but unmistakably. I didn't know what it meant yet. But I knew this trip was no longer just a trip. It was the beginning of something I wasn't prepared for. The next morning started quietly, with the soft sound of wind pushing against the wooden walls of the lodge. I woke up earlier than expected, unsure if it was the cold or the thoughts from last night still rotating in my mind. When I stepped outside, he was already sitting on the porch, staring at the mountains wrapped in early fog. He looked peaceful, almost lost in the view, and for a moment I wondered what was going on inside his head. He looked over when he heard me, offering a small smile. "Sleep okay?" he asked. I nodded, even though I hadn't really slept well. There had been too many thoughts, too much awareness of how different he made me feel. He stood up and handed me a cup of warm tea he had made earlier. Again, a simple gesture, yet it warmed me more than the tea itself. We started our second hike of the trip, a longer and more challenging trail. At first, we walked quietly, letting the calmness of the morning wrap around us. Birds echoed through the valley, and the sun slowly climbed over the peaks. I felt lighter than I had in a long time, as if the mountain air was washing away everything I tried to ignore back home. As the trail got steeper, he kept checking on me. When I stumbled slightly, he reached out without hesitation, holding me until I regained my balance. His hand was warm, steady. I felt something in my chest tighten, something confusing but undeniable. I pulled away quickly, not wanting him to notice, but he didn't say anything. After a while, he stopped beside a large rock overlooking the valley. "Can I tell you something?" he asked, his voice different, lower, heavier. I sat beside him, my heartbeat already picking up without knowing why. He looked straight ahead, not at me. "I used to have a crush on you. Years ago." The words came out quietly but clearly. "I never said anything because of your brother. And because you were already committed." He finally turned to look at me. "I just wanted you to know." My breath caught. I didn't know what to say, or what I was supposed to say. His honesty hit me harder than I expected, and the fact that he had kept it hidden all this time made something inside me stir in a way I wasn't prepared for. I forced out a small laugh, more nervous than amused. "Why are you telling me this now?" He shrugged lightly. "Maybe because being here with you feels different. Maybe because you look tired. And I just want you to know someone notices you." His eyes softened. "Someone sees you." Quote. Those words, "someone sees you," struck deeper than anything else. No one had said something like that to me in years. I felt something warm build behind my ribs, something dangerously close to vulnerability. I looked away before my expression gave it all away. A sudden gust of cold wind rushed through the trees, and dark clouds began gathering overhead. He stood up quickly. "Storm's coming. We need to head toward that cabin before it hits." We hurried along the trail, the wind picking up, raindrops starting to fall. By the time we reached the small wooden cabin, the sky had turned dark, and the rain was coming down hard. Inside, it was dim and quiet except for the sound of rain slamming against the roof. We sat close to each other simply because the cabin was small, but the closeness felt heavier than the storm outside. I could feel the warmth of his shoulder, the unspoken things hanging between us. He broke the silence first. "You don't have to tell me anything about your relationship if you don't want to." His voice was gentle, almost careful. "But, you look like someone who's carrying too much alone." I didn't know why, but the walls I had been holding up for so long suddenly felt thinner. Maybe it was the storm, the isolation, or the way he listened without judgment. I found myself telling him things I hadn't told anyone, how distant things had become, how unseen I felt, how I wasn't sure if love was still love when it no longer felt alive. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to solve anything. He just listened, and somehow that made me feel more exposed than if he had touched me. When I finally stopped talking, he whispered, "You deserve more than feeling invisible." Those words echoed in the cabin, louder than the thunder. I felt myself leaning slightly toward him before I caught myself. Our eyes met, too close, too long, and the moment hovered, fragile and dangerous. I felt the possibility of crossing a line I wasn't ready to face. My breath shook slightly as I pulled back, staring at the floor. He didn't move closer. He didn't push. He just stayed there, letting me breathe, letting the moment settle. But the truth was undeniable now. Something had shifted between us, something I couldn't ignore or pretend didn't exist. And as the storm grew stronger outside, I realized the conflict inside me was growing even faster. The storm finally slowed by late afternoon, leaving only a soft drizzle tapping against the roof. We stepped out of the cabin when the clouds thinned, and the world around us felt washed clean, quiet, fresh, and strangely calm. But inside me, nothing felt calm. Everything felt louder, sharper, heavier. The things he had said, the things I had felt, the closeness we had almost crossed into, it all sat in my chest like a weight I couldn't name. The walk back to the lodge was slow. Neither of us spoke much, but the silence wasn't like before. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was full of everything we weren't saying. At one point I caught him glancing at me, as if checking whether I regretted what had almost happened. I wasn't sure of the answer myself. When we reached the lodge, he helped me remove my damp jacket. His fingers brushed mine accidentally, and even that tiny touch felt too intense. I stepped back quickly, needing space to breathe. He seemed to understand. He nodded once, gently, and went to start a small fire to warm the room. I watched him for a moment, the kindness in his movements, the patience in the way he spoke, the warmth he carried without trying. It was so different from what I had grown used to at home that it almost hurt to acknowledge. Later that evening, we sat across from each other, sharing a simple meal. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence we didn't know how to break. Finally, he set his fork down and looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. "I don't want to make anything harder for you," he said quietly. "I don't want to come between you and your relationship." His voice held sincerity, not pity, not pressure, just honesty. I looked down at my hands. "You didn't come between anything," I said, though even I wasn't sure if that was true. Things were already broken. I just didn't want to admit it. He leaned back slightly, as if the weight of those words settled on him too. "I care about you," he whispered. "But I don't want you to make choices because of me." His restraint, his awareness, the softness in his voice, it all made everything harder and easier at the same time. I opened my mouth to say something, but no words came out. So instead, I stood up and walked toward the balcony. The night air was cold but refreshing. From inside, I heard him move around quietly, giving me space without being asked. On the drive back the next morning, the world looked different. Roads we had driven just 2 days before now felt heavier, more familiar and yet unrecognizable. We didn't talk much, but it wasn't awkward. It was thoughtful, like both of us were trying to hold on to something without crossing a line. When we finally reached my house, he parked slowly, turning off the engine but not moving. The neighborhood looked exactly the same, quiet streets, hedges trimmed neatly, the same door I walked through every day. Yet I felt like I had left something behind in the mountains, and brought something else home with me. He turned to me, his voice low. "Whatever happens, I'm here. Not to interfere, just here." He didn't touch me. He didn't lean in. He simply offered presence, and somehow that meant more than anything physical could have. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. Then I stepped out of the car. Inside, my partner was sitting on the couch, barely looking up when I entered. The distance between us felt clearer than ever. It wasn't just indifference anymore, it was absence. I sat down across from him and for the first time in months, tried to talk. Really talk. About loneliness, about feeling invisible, about how far we had drifted. He listened, but not the way the man on the mountain had listened. His responses were short, defensive, tired. And I realized then that I had spent a long time convincing myself something was still alive when it had already faded. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat alone in the quiet room, replaying the past few days. The mountain air, the storm shelter, the warmth of someone who saw me without asking anything in return. I knew I couldn't pretend anymore, not about my relationship, not about my feelings, not about what my heart was trying to tell me. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if anything would develop with my brother's friend, or if our moment on the mountain was simply a reminder of what I deserved but had forgotten. But I did know one thing. Once you finally feel seen, you can't go back to being invisible.